Hi there, I'm Dr. Rehani. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about holistic first aid, natural first aid that can be used at home for your animals or even for yourself. So when we talk about first aid, what do we mean exactly? We're talking about blows, falls, concussions, injuries, bleeding, hemorrhages, bruises, wounds that are large or even small, cuts, shock and trauma. Let's talk first about shock and trauma, because this is a very important thing to cover in first aid. Shock itself can actually kill the patient before anything else can. It's a result of circulation changes in the body, and the body actually shuts down. The patient might be extremely fearful or restless, or zoned out from the fear or pain. In this kind of situation, we'd be talking about a major trauma, such as a hit by a car, a concussion, something where there is a major impact either emotionally or physically to the patient. The body is not able to cope, and death can occur quite quickly from shock. Often dogs who are hit by cars will actually die from the shock even before they get to the vet. This is why it's so useful and helpful to have homeopathy with you and to understand how to use the homeopathic remedies in a first aid situation. So what are the causes of shock? So we talked about trauma, hit by a car, accidents, a stroke or heart attack in a human or even in an animal, a cat or a dog, or a horse, head trauma or a concussion, blood loss and dehydration. If there's hemorrhages or bleeding or fluid loss, that could include diarrhea if there is, or vomiting. If there's consistent vomiting and diarrhea that leads to a severe state of dehydration, it can cause shock as well. And we might have bleeding in an animal that has just given birth. We might have hemorrhaging in an animal that has a tumor of the spleen or something like that. That can also cause shock to start pretty quickly, or a large wound that causes hemorrhaging or blood loss. So any of those things. If there's an extreme change of body temperature, an animal becomes, or a patient or human becomes frozen, being outside or getting in some cold water, they're in the wilderness and for some reason they're lost, they can't get back, then those things can also lead to shock. So let's talk about concussions, and here our diagram talks about children, but of course this would apply to adults as well as animals. So the causes of concussion most often are struck by an object. So that could include a tennis ball in a small dog or a cat, or a 2x4 or something. Fall is the greatest amount, so falling from a height and hitting the head, which can happen in any kind of patient, human or animal, and then collisions. I would say in animals, probably the collision rate is much higher because of the hit by car problem. They're a lot more versatile than we are in agile, so the fall rate is not as big. So when we have a concussion, what happens is there is trauma to the skull, and that skull radiates and causes trauma to the brain. You can see in this illustration, the red area is an area of the brain that has been bruised. So that's really what a concussion is. Now we're going to talk a bit about shock. We mentioned that a bit earlier. Fear can also cause shock. In humans, if you have witnessed a really bad accident or you've received some bad news over the phone about a loved one, that can cause a state of immediate shock where the body goes into a numb state because it just can't comprehend the information that's being given. Right? Getting bad news about someone's death. Females giving birth can also be in a state of shock and fear because of the process, the pain, that kind of thing. fear of death in a situation if there is trauma or some type of situation where the body or the patient feels that they are going to die immediately, that can cause shock as well. And fear of death for a loved one. So in the entire course, and I'll repeat this a few times, all of the homeopathic remedies we're going to discuss decrease the frequency of treatment as the patient improves. So for example, if you were giving a remedy twice a day, as the patient gets better, decrease it to once a day. And stop the remedy when the patient is better. So what we're doing here is we're trying to stimulate the body to heal itself. So we need to listen to the body. It's not similar to conventional medicine where you would repeat antibiotic every day, twice a day for 14 days. Here we're stimulating the body, so initially you might need to give the remedy more often, especially in a first aid situation where the body's in shock, and then you can decrease the frequency. You may be able to stop the frequency fairly quickly in a first aid situation once the body responds. Or if it's something more chronic, you might be able to decrease it to once a day or every other day until the patient is much better. And with all the remedies we're going to discuss, either give them in a 30C or 200C potency. In some areas that's known as a CH. A 200C is stronger, so if it's not a bad idea to have both potencies on hand, but if you can only have one, try and find a 200C. In emergencies and first aid, the situation is very intense, so the higher potency can be used quite easily by the body and sometimes is needed by the body. A dose is actually 2 pellets. However, often you may need it 2 to 3 times a day. Some of the companies list 5 pellets on the vial, and that is not necessary. 2 pellets is actually a standard dose. Doesn't matter if it's a mouse or a horse or an elephant or a human. And you will continue the remedy until the symptoms resolve. Sometimes it can actually be 1 dose that will set the whole situation straight, and that's all the patient needs. If it's an emergency and you are able to crush the pellets for an animal, that's better. If you're not able to crush the pellets, that's okay. Just give the remedy, it'll work anyway. If the patient is unconscious, you can add a bit of the remedy to some water and give the mixed solution of the remedy and the water together and just drip it into the gums of the gums or tongue area. This is my little girl Nikita. So the first remedy we're going to talk about is aconite napellus. Aconite in the old days was known as wolf's bane or the bane of the wolf. It was used to poison wolves. It was on the tips of the spears. One easy way to remember this remedy is to think about all of the indications of poisoning. So if you found out suddenly that that coffee you drank was actually poison, which it kind of is, but not in a real way, what would your reaction be? So you would have a sudden onset of a change of feeling. You would feel panicky, fearful. You would have a fear of dying. And that fear can be overwhelming. Your heart rate will go up. You will have an increased pulse rate. You might start shaking or have tremors. Or you might be catatonic and zoned out, paralyzed with fear. So all these reactions of aconite can be remembered because it used to be used as a poison for wolves. So think of symptoms of poisoning when the person first realizes that they've been poisoned. What is the immediate reaction? And that's a good way to remember this remedy and where it can be used. So the keynotes for aconite are sudden onset of symptoms. So it comes on very quickly. The change is immediate in the state of the patient. They may be restless with fear or they may be paralyzed with fear. So there can be one or the other extreme. They're very panicky and fearful. They may go into shock very quickly. So we talked a little bit about shock earlier. Blood pressure changes, circulation collapses, they might faint. So aconite is the remedy you want to give first in any kind of severe shock situation where there's a trauma, an accident, or an injury. If they're hit by a car, they have a stroke, head trauma, concussion, if there's a loss of blood, a fall, a blow anywhere that there is a major trauma to the patient of any kind, aconite is the first remedy to give, especially when there is a fear of death or fright at the sight of blood or an accident, fright on hearing of an accident or injury to a loved one. All right, so again, the first remedy to give in a shock and trauma, of course the keynotes must fit, but they usually do. A dose of 30 or 200 C. Repeat as needed until the patient is stable. It can be repeated every 5 to 30 minutes for 2 to 3 doses to calm the patient down. The patient might actually sleep, be relaxed enough to sleep after the trauma, and that's a really good sign. Sometimes one dose can be enough. We always have to remember that we are giving the homeopathic remedies to effect, allowing the patient to guide you on how much they need. Okay, so it's not a mechanical repetition like it is with conventional medicine. So we're gonna, because we're stimulating the body's own healing ability, we will give as much as the body needs. Aconite is also an excellent remedy for injuries to the eye, whether it's dust or something foreign. There can be burning and sudden swelling of the lids. The eyelids can swell so much that they can't be opened except with great difficulty. And there can be intense burning and stabbing pain, hot tears from the eyes. Many years ago, when my youngest was 2 years old, she had a really bad fall. We were baking some cake and she was sitting on the counter with me, and I asked her to stay there for a second while I turned to grab a pot or something, and of course she didn't stay. She moved and she fell headfirst off the counter onto the hardwood floor and banged her head. So that was not a good thing. She started crying, of course, but she did have a concussion, and she had something called rapid eye movement or nystagmus horizontally, which indicates that there has been a concussion or damage to the brain. And I initially gave her arnica for the pain, and she stopped crying, but she still had the horizontal nystagmus, which is not a good thing for a child. So I then gave her aconite, and within a couple of minutes, the nystagmus stopped. So much faster than waiting for an ambulance to come, and by then, who knows if the damage would have been permanent. But she was able to heal herself very easily with the aid of aconite. For myself, I had an ulcer on my eye when returning from Mexico a few years ago. I wear contact lenses, and because of the dry air on the plane, my contacts began to irritate my eye. And the next morning I woke up with an eye that looked like something out of a scary movie. So you can see how swollen it was. Now, this is actually after my eye had been healing for it was about 50% better by this point. I was too panicked at the beginning to take a photo, but it really looked horrific, and this is already bad enough, and this is 50% better than it was originally. And I was taking homeopathic remedies, and of course, because I was in a state of panic, I couldn't figure out which remedy to take, and I did not take aconite. I took a bunch of others, and I wasn't getting any better. The eye wasn't going down, and I was starting to panic that I was going to lose my vision, have to go to emergency, etc. And I called a colleague and said, I think I'm going to die, my eye. And she said, did you take aconite? And I said, no. And she said, take aconite. And I did. And immediately, within a few minutes, the pain started to subside. And I kept repeating the remedy every 15 minutes or so. So this is the 50% mark. This is where it looked 50% better than it had originally. When I went to the optometrist, I had a very large ulcer on the eye. So over the weekend, I continued to take the aconite, and you can see here it's a bit less swollen. When I came back to Vancouver, I had been out of town. I saw the optometrist after taking aconite for about 2 days. Sorry, I saw the optometrist about on day 7, but I took the aconite for about 2 days. And when he looked at my eye, he said that he couldn't see any evidence of a scar, and if he didn't have the medical record from the other optometrist, he wouldn't have believed I had had a scar because it healed so nicely. So that's how my eye looked afterwards. So it's still a little bit red. My eyes are always red because they're a bit dry, but you can see the difference in the swelling. And here's a good contrast for you, beginning and after. So that's the power of homeopathy and what it can do for you. And let me tell you, it was so painful. I have not experienced pain like that. Well, I have, but it's excruciatingly painful, so I was very thankful that homeopathy could help. Out of desperation, I had taken a painkiller because I was away. And as I said, I was in a state of panic and none of the remedies were working, and the painkiller did not touch it, but the aconite did. So again, homeopathy can really save your life. Here's my two little pushies. There's Brucey and Bella. They hate each other, but when the dog is around, they team up against the dog, so you can see they're hanging out together.